Ethan Miller was training his 3 German Shepherds on their Wyoming ranch when his daughter Lily spotted something unusual in the snow. A tiny, blood-covered bobcat kitten lay dying beneath a fallen pine. Its mother nowhere to be found. 6 months later, the Miller family stood in court, fighting for the right to keep Scout, the now healthy bobcat that had learned to sit, fetch, and even howl alongside its canine family. When the judge ordered Scout to be released into the wild 100 miles away, none of them could have predicted the journey that would follow, a journey that would challenge everything. Wildlife experts believed about animal instinct and leave an entire community forever changed. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The Miller Ranch sat nestled in a remote valley of Wyoming, just 30 miles from Grand Teton National Park. In autumn, the aspen trees turned the mountainsides into sheets of gold, but when winter descended, the landscape transformed into an unforgiving expanse of white. It was the kind of isolation that either healed your soul or drove you mad. And for Ethan Miller, it had been doing a little of both over the past 3 years. Ethan stood on his porch at dawn, coffee steam rising into the frigid air as he surveyed his property. At 42, his face had weathered beyond his years, deep lines around his eyes from squinting into desert suns during his Army Ranger deployments, premature gray streaking his dark hair. The physical scars from combat had faded, but the ones left by Sarah's death remained raw. 5 years had passed since the car accident that took his wife and stole his daughter's voice. But on mornings like this, it felt like yesterday. The sound of paws on wooden steps pulled him from his thoughts. Shadow, his oldest German Shepherd, nudged his hand. The 8-year-old former military working dog had served alongside Ethan in Afghanistan, where they'd formed a bond that transcended the usual handler-canine relationship. Shadow's dark eyes held an intelligence that sometimes unnerved visitors, as if he understood every word spoken around him. "Morning, old friend," Ethan murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears. Other two still sleeping. As if in answer, Duke and Riley bounded around the corner of the house, sending snow flying. Duke, the middle dog at 5 years old, carried the physical and emotional scars of abuse from before Ethan rescued him. Despite his traumatic past, or perhaps because of it, Duke had developed an uncanny sensitivity to suffering, often the first to detect when Lily was having a bad day. Riley, barely 2 years old and born on the ranch, possessed none of his brother's darkness, a perpetual puppy, despite his impressive size. Inside the ranch house, Grace Miller stood at the kitchen counter, already dressed in her veterinary scrubs. At 38, Ethan's younger sister shared his strong jawline and dark hair, though hers remained stubbornly free of gray. She'd moved to the ranch after Sarah's death, putting her small-town veterinary practice on hold to help raise Lily. Ethan knew she carried her own burden of guilt. She'd been on the phone with Sarah when the accident happened, a fact she'd never forgiven herself for. "You're up early," she commented, sliding a plate of eggs toward him. "Bad night." Ethan nodded. The nightmares had returned with the approaching winter. "Where's Lily?" "Still asleep. She was up late with those wildlife journals of hers." Lily's room told the story of a child split between 2 worlds. Half contained the remnants of a typical 12-year-old girl, faded stuffed animals, a bookshelf lined with well-worn favorites. The other half resembled a junior naturalist's laboratory, detailed sketches of local wildlife, feathers and interesting rocks collected on walks, and meticulously kept observation journals. On her desk sat a framed photograph of Sarah holding a 4-year-old Lily, both laughing at the camera. It was the only photograph of her mother that Lily could bear to look at. The ranch's isolation had been deliberate. After months of Lily's silence following Sarah's death, after specialists and therapists had tried everything, Ethan had made the decision to leave their suburban Colorado life behind. Here, away from pitying glances and uncomfortable questions. Lily had found a different kind of communication with the animals, with nature. She hadn't spoken a word to another human being in 5 years, but Ethan had seen her lips moving when she thought no one was watching, whispering secrets to the horses in the barn or to the wild deer that sometimes ventured near the property line at dusk, 15 miles away, in the town of Rivercrest. Thomas Blackwood sat in his trophy-lined office. At 55, Blackwood had built his logging fortune through means that didn't always stand up to scrutiny. As president of the local hunting association, his walls displayed heads of elk, moose, and other game, some taken legally, others not. What they didn't show were the rare predator pelts hidden in his private collection. The rivalry between Blackwood and Ethan went back to their shared military past, a story neither man discussed, but neither had forgotten. Across town, Wildlife Conservation Officer Jessica Morgan was already at her desk, reviewing reported wolf sightings. At 35, Jessica had earned respect in a department dominated by men who'd initially dismissed her. Her Shoshone grandfather had taught her to see the land and its creatures differently than her colleagues did, not as resources to be managed, but as relations to be respected. This perspective often put her at odds with department policy, but it had also made her one of their most effective rangers. She hadn't yet met Ethan Miller, though she'd heard stories about the reclusive ex-soldier and his silent daughter. She didn't know that their paths would soon cross, or how that meeting would change everything. The day began like any other on the Miller Ranch, with no hint of how it would alter their lives forever. The first snowstorm of the season had been forecast, but the speed with which it descended surprised even Ethan, who had learned to respect Wyoming's mercurial weather patterns. What had begun as a light dusting during his morning chores had transformed into blinding sheets of white by early afternoon. "We'd better check the north fence line before this gets any worse," Ethan called to Lily, who was bundled in her blue parka by the barn door. "Those posts were wobbly last week." Lily nodded, her dark eyes serious beneath her wool hat. Without a word, she whistled for the dogs, a sharp sound that cut through the howling wind. Shadow, Duke, and Riley materialized from different corners of the property, falling into formation beside her as naturally as if they were extensions of her small body, as they trudged through deepening snow. Ethan watched his daughter walking slightly ahead with the 3 massive German shepherds flanking her protectively. There was something almost mystical about the way the animals responded to her silent commands, a slight gesture of her gloved hand, or the most subtle change in her posture. He sometimes wondered if they understood her better than he did. "Storm's picking up faster than I thought," Ethan shouted over the wind when they reached the fence line. "We should head back." The darkening sky confirmed his instincts. This was developing into the kind of blizzard that claimed lives in these mountains, the kind that had nearly claimed his once before. Unbidden, memories of another snowstorm surfaced Sarah's car, the icy roads, the call that had cut off mid-sentence. He pushed the thoughts away, focusing instead on getting Lily safely home. They were halfway back to the ranch house when Shadow suddenly froze, his body tense as a bowstring. Duke and Riley immediately went on alert, following the older dog's gaze toward a fallen pine that had succumbed to heavy snow. Without barking unusual for German shepherds sensing potential danger, Shadow stalked toward the tree, his movements deliberate and focused. "Shadow, heel," Ethan commanded, concerned about what might be hiding beneath the fallen timber. Bears should be denning by now, but cougars were always a possibility. For the first time in their long partnership, Shadow ignored Ethan's command completely. Duke and Riley followed their pack leader, forming a tight triangle as they approached the fallen tree. Lily, ignoring her father's outstretched hand, hurried after them. "Lily, wait," Ethan called, but his voice was swallowed by the wind. By the time he caught up, Lily was already kneeling in the snow beside the dogs, who had formed a protective semicircle around something at the base of the fallen pine. Her small shoulders were shaking, and for one terrible moment, Ethan thought she was crying something he hadn't seen since Sarah's funeral. But when she turned to him, her expression wasn't one of sorrow but of fierce determination. She pointed urgently at what lay partially buried in the snow, a tiny blood-smeared ball of spotted fur barely larger than her mitten. "Jesus," Ethan breathed, kneeling beside her. The bobcat kitten was so young its eyes hadn't fully changed from blue to their adult yellow-green. Its spotted fur was matted with blood, though Ethan couldn't immediately determine if it was the kitten's or its mother's. One thing was certain: no mother bobcat would willingly abandon a kitten this young, especially not in a snowstorm. Shadow gently nudged the nearly motionless form with his nose, then looked up at Ethan with an expectation that needed no translation. Duke whined softly, while Riley circled restlessly, sniffing the air for threats. "It's barely alive," Ethan said, removing his glove to feel the kitten's faint heartbeat through its mud-cold fur. His eyes tracked a trail of blood leading deeper into the forest. Something happened to its mother. Stepping carefully around the dogs and Lily, Ethan followed the blood trail a short distance, half hidden by drifting snow. The metallic glint of a poacher's trap confirmed his suspicions. The serrated jaws were sprung shut. Tufts of adult bobcat fur caught in its teeth. The mother had likely been wounded by the illegal trap, possibly managing to escape only to succumb to her injuries nearby. Lily tugged urgently at his sleeve, gesturing first to the kitten and then toward home, her eyes wide with pleading. Ethan knew what she was asking. He also knew all the reasons why they shouldn't interfere. He was no stranger to the harsh realities of nature as a biologist before his military service. He'd conducted extensive research on predator species. Taking in a wild animal, especially a predator, rarely ended well for either the animal or the humans involved. "Lily, honey, we can't just—" he began, but stopped when he saw her expression harden into the same stubborn determination that had been Sarah's trademark. The kitten made a feeble sound, somewhere between a mew and a wheeze. Shadow responded by carefully laying down, pressing his warm body against the dying creature. Duke and Riley followed suit, forming a living barrier against the wind and cold. The image struck Ethan with unexpected force. These predators, bred for generations to track and hunt, instead protecting a natural competitor with their own bodies. It echoed painfully with another memory: Sarah, kneeling in spring mud, splinting the wing of a red-tailed hawk that had crashed into their Denver apartment window. "Everything deserves a fighting chance, Ethan," she'd said. "Nature may be cruel, but we don't have to be." He made his decision. "If we take it, Lily, it doesn't mean we can keep it," he cautioned, already shrugging off his outer jacket. "We get it warm, get it to Grace, and then call wildlife services." The relief on his daughter's face was worth the compromise, though he suspected she'd have her own ideas about what happened next. Carefully, he wrapped the nearly lifeless kitten in his jacket, cradling it against his chest. Shadow led the way back through the intensifying storm, breaking a path through snow that now reached his chest in deeper drifts. Grace was waiting on the porch when they finally emerged from the white curtain of the blizzard, her face tight with worry that quickly turned to exasperation when she saw the bundle in Ethan's arms. "Tell me that's not what I think it is," she said, holding the door open against the wind. "Doctor's coming out in you already," Ethan replied, stomping snow from his boots. "Good. It's going to need all your skills to survive the night." 3 months passed since that fateful snowstorm, months that transformed the tiny, half-dead bobcat kitten into a thriving young predator with decidedly unconventional behaviors. The Millers had named him Scout, after the character in Lily's dog-eared copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, a name that had particular significance as it was the first word Lily had spoken aloud in 5 years, whispered to the barely conscious kitten on that first night. "Scout's in the paddock again," Grace called from the kitchen window one crisp March morning. "He's herding the chickens like they're sheep." Ethan looked up from his coffee to see the young bobcat, now the size of a large house cat, but with the distinctive bobbed tail and tufted ears of his species, trotting alongside the chicken coop, guiding stray birds back toward their enclosure with the same focused intensity Shadow employed with the ranch's few cattle. "He shouldn't be able to do that," Grace said. "Not for the first time. Bobcats don't herd, they hunt. They don't cooperate, they compete. Everything Scout does defies natural behavior patterns." Ethan watched as the 3 German shepherds supervised Scout's efforts from their positions around the barnyard. The dogs had taken on the role of mentors to the young bobcat with a seriousness that would have been comical if it wasn't so extraordinary. Shadow taught discipline and boundaries, Duke demonstrated gentleness, and young Riley offered lessons in play. Scout had absorbed these teachings with remarkable aptitude. "He doesn't know he's supposed to be a solitary ambush predator," Ethan replied. "He thinks he's a dog." The bobcat's development had been documented meticulously in Lily's growing collection of observation journals. Scout had first attempted to bark at 6 weeks, producing an odd sound between a hiss and a cough that had evolved into a passable imitation of Riley's warning bark. He came when called an unheard-of behavior in felines, let alone wild ones. Most remarkably, he had integrated himself into the dog's established pack structure, deferring to Shadow, protecting Riley during play, and seeking out Duke when startled. For Lily, Scout's presence had catalyzed a transformation almost as remarkable as the bobcat's own. She now spoke freely to all 4 animals, her voice soft but clear when she thought herself unobserved. She had yet to speak to another human, but Ethan had noticed her watching his and Grace's lips with increasing attention when they spoke, as if relearning a forgotten language. "We can't keep this quiet forever," Grace said, her expression troubled. "Someone's going to find out?" Ethan knew she was right. They had managed to avoid involving wildlife authorities by telling Dr. Peterson in town that they were rehabilitating an orphaned domestic cat when Grace needed medical supplies. But Scout was growing rapidly, his wild nature becoming more evident even as his behaviors remained decidedly un-bobcat-like. It was only a matter of time. That time came sooner than expected. 3 days later, Ethan was repairing fence posts when a dusty government jeep pulled into the ranch driveway. A slender woman in a Forest Service uniform stepped out, adjusting her ranger hat against the sun. Something about her movements, efficient but graceful, caught his attention even before he registered the Wildlife Conservation badge on her jacket. "Mr. Miller," she called. "I'm Officer Jessica Morgan, Wyoming Wildlife Conservation." Ethan straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans as he approached. "What can I do for you?" "Officer Morgan. I've received reports about an illegally kept wild animal on this property." Her tone was professional but not unfriendly. "Specifically, a juvenile bobcat." Ethan's mind raced. They'd been so careful. Dr. Peterson had promised discretion. Then he remembered Lily's school presentation 2 weeks ago. She'd brought her wildlife journal, filled with detailed observations and sketches of Scout. Her teacher, Mrs. Winters, was married to Thomas Blackwood's foreman. "Who reported this?" he asked, though he already suspected. "I'm not at liberty to say." Officer Morgan's dark eyes assessed him carefully. "But I'll need to see the animal, Mr. Miller." Before Ethan could respond, a commotion from the barn drew their attention. Scout burst into view, chasing a ball that Riley had batted his way. The young bobcat pounced, caught the ball, and trotted proudly back to where the 3 German shepherds waited, dropping it at Shadow's feet with the distinct air of seeking approval. Officer Morgan stared, her professional composure momentarily forgotten. "That's not possible." "That's Scout," Ethan said simply. "He's playing fetch. Bobcats don't play fetch. This one does. He also sits on command. comes when called, and tries to herd chickens." Ethan watched her face as she processed what she was seeing. "We found him dying in last December's blizzard. Mother was killed by an illegal trap." Something flickered in Jessica's eyes at the mention of the trap. "You should have reported it immediately." "We meant to," Ethan admitted. "But the storm cut us off for nearly a week. By the time roads cleared, Scout was already forming attachments to the dogs. My sister's a vet, she said moving him then would have killed him." Jessica walked closer to the animals, maintaining a respectful distance. The 3 dogs immediately placed themselves between her and Scout, not aggressively, but protectively. The bobcat peered curiously at the newcomer from behind Duke's substantial form. "I've been in wildlife conservation for 12 years, she said, shaking her head slightly. "I've never seen anything like this." "Neither had we." Something shifted in her expression, the ranger giving way momentarily to the woman. "Your daughter Lily, right? I heard she doesn't speak." "She speaks to Scout," Ethan said quietly. "First time in 5 years she's spoken to anyone." Jessica looked torn, the conflict between professional duty and human compassion evident on her face. "Mr. Miller, I understand your situation, but I'm legally obligated to report this. Keeping native wildlife without proper permits is a federal offense." "Then we'll apply for the permits," Ethan said. "There must be exceptions for special circumstances. Wildlife rehabilitation permits require specialized training, facilities, and—" She stopped, watching as Lily emerged from the barn. The girl moved with unusual confidence, Scout trotting at her heels like an attentive shadow. When she spotted the ranger, she froze momentarily before squaring her small shoulders and continuing forward. She stopped beside her father, one hand resting protectively on Scout's head. "Hello, Lily," Jessica said gently. "That's quite a special friend you have there." To Ethan's surprise, Lily reached into her pocket and withdrew her observation journal, extending it toward Jessica with a determined expression. The gesture was clear. "See what I see. Understand him as I do." Jessica accepted the journal, leafing through pages of meticulous notes, detailed behavioral observations, and remarkably skilled sketches documenting Scout's development. Her eyebrows rose as she progressed through the journal, occasionally glancing between the pages and the bobcat, who was now sitting patiently at Lily's feet in a distinctly unfeline posture. "This is extraordinary research," Jessica finally said, returning the journal. "You've documented behaviors that contradict everything we know about bobcat development," Lily nodded solemnly. "I still have to report this," Jessica said, addressing Ethan again, "but I'll include Lily's observations. They might help your case for a special permit." She hesitated, then added, "There's something else you should know. The illegal trapping in this area has increased significantly in the past year. We believe someone is running a black market operation targeting predator species." "Blackwood," Ethan said flatly. Jessica neither confirmed nor denied, but her expression told him enough. "Be careful, Mr. Miller. Certain people in this county don't appreciate being investigated. I'll be back tomorrow with the proper forms for your permit application." As Jessica drove away, Grace joined them in the yard. "That went better than expected," she observed. "It's not over," Ethan replied, watching dust rise from the departing jeep. "It's just beginning." That evening, as shadows lengthened across the ranch, Lily sat on the porch steps with Scout curled against her side, the 3 dogs arrayed protectively around them. She was reading aloud from her book, her voice soft but steady, a voice finding its strength again after years of silence. Inside, Ethan and Grace spoke in hushed tones about permit applications, legal options, and contingency plans. Neither voiced the fear that had taken root in both their minds what would happen to Lily if Scout were taken away. The first hearing regarding Scout's fate was held in the Rivercrest County Courthouse. a century-old stone building that had witnessed generations of local disputes but never one quite like this. The Miller family arrived early, Ethan in an uncomfortable suit that had last been worn at Sarah's funeral, Grace in a professional skirt and blazer, and Lily clutching her wildlife journals to her chest like armor. Scout remained at the ranch under the watchful eyes of Shadow, Duke, and Riley. "Remember," Grace whispered as they climbed the courthouse steps, "let me do most of the talking. I've prepared all the medical documentation showing Scout's unusual development." Ethan nodded, his attention focused on the small gathering of protesters near the entrance, half-carried signs supporting the Miller family's right to keep Scout, with messages like "Family is more than blood" and "Save Scout." The others, fewer in number but more vocal, brandished opposing placards declaring "Wild animals belong in the wild" and "No exceptions to wildlife laws." Thomas Blackwood stood at the edge of the anti-Scout group, his expensively tailored suit setting him apart from the denim-clad hunters and ranchers he'd rallied to his cause. When he spotted Ethan, a cold smile spread across his face. "Miller," he called, loud enough for nearby reporters to hear. "Still think you're above the law, first trespassing, now this." Ethan kept walking, a hand on Lily's shoulder to guide her past the commotion. The trespassing accusation was a twisted version of events from the previous year, when Ethan had followed suspicious tire tracks across the edge of Blackwood's property and discovered freshly skinned carcasses of protected species. His report to the rangers had been dismissed due to lack of evidence and the fact he'd crossed the property line without permission. Inside the courtroom, Jessica Morgan sat on the government side but offered Ethan a subtle nod when their eyes met. Beside her, a stone-faced representative from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service consulted a thick binder of regulations. The proceedings began with clinical efficiency. The state's case was straightforward. Federal law prohibited private citizens from keeping native wildlife without specialized permits, which the Millers lacked. The prosecution presented a series of expert witnesses, wildlife biologists, conservation officers, and predator specialists, all testifying to the dangers and ethical concerns of keeping a wild predator in a domestic setting. Even with the most well-intentioned human caregivers, testified Dr. Harrison, a silver-haired professor from the University of Wyoming, a bobcat remains a wild animal governed by instinct. As Scout matures, those instincts will inevitably assert themselves, potentially endangering the Miller family and their domestic animals. When it was the defense's turn, Grace presented Scout's medical records, growth charts, and behavioral assessments. "The circumstances of Scout's rescue and subsequent development are unprecedented," she argued. "He has formed social bonds not typical of his species, demonstrating behaviors more commonly associated with canines than felines." The judge, an older woman with shrewd eyes and a reputation for strict interpretation of the law, leaned forward. "Dr. Miller, I understand you have scientific documentation, but the law doesn't make exceptions based on unusual behavioral development." "Your Honor," Grace countered, "there are provisions within the Endangered Species Act for special permits in extraordinary circumstances where the welfare of the animal is best served in human care. While bobcats aren't endangered, the same principle should apply." Next came Dr. Butts Morris, Lily's therapist, who testified about Scout's critical role in Lily's psychological recovery. "In my 30 years of practice, I've never witnessed such a profound therapeutic breakthrough," he explained. "Lily's selective mutism following her mother's death remained resistant to all conventional treatments. Her relationship with Scout has accomplished what years of therapy could not." As Dr. Morris spoke, Ethan watched Lily sitting beside him, her small face solemn as she listened to adults discussing her future and Scout's as if they were separate things. He knew, with a father's certainty, that in her mind they were not. when Dr. Morris finished. The defense called Jessica Morgan to the stand. Her testimony walked a careful line between professional obligation and personal conviction. "The bobcat known as Scout displays behavioral patterns I've never observed in wild felines," she stated. "While I initially came to investigate an illegal wildlife possession, what I discovered was something that challenges our understanding of interspecies bonding and adaptive behavior." During cross-examination, the prosecution pressed her hard. "Officer Morgan, regardless of this animal's unusual behavior, does Mr. Miller have the legal right to keep it without proper permits?" "No," Jessica admitted. "But this case merits consideration for a special permit given the exceptional circumstances." "And who would make that determination?" "Ultimately, the state wildlife director, in consultation with federal authorities." The same director who has already denied the preliminary application. Jessica's hesitation was brief but noticeable. "Yes." The breaking point came unexpectedly during the third day of hearings. The prosecution had just finished questioning a veterinarian who specialized in wild felines when Blackwood, sitting in the gallery, made a loud, dismissive noise at the mention of Scout's canine behaviors. Lily, who had remained silent throughout the proceedings, suddenly stood. Before Ethan could stop her, she walked directly to the judge's bench, placed her journals on it, and opened to specific pages. Then, to the astonishment of everyone in the courtroom, she spoke. "Scout is family." Her voice, unused with humans for so long, sounded strange even to Ethan's ears, higher and more childlike than the voice she used with Scout and the dogs. "Please look." The courtroom fell absolutely silent. The judge, recovering from her surprise, examined the pages Lily had presented, detailed drawings comparing Scout's body language with photographs of wild bobcats and domestic dogs, alongside methodical documentation of his daily behaviors. "Young lady," the judge said finally, "did you create these observations yourself?" Lily nodded. "Every day since Scout came." "And this is your conclusion, that Scout behaves more like a dog than a bobcat?" "He doesn't know he's a bobcat," Lily said simply. "He thinks he's a dog because that's his family." For a moment, the legal battle seemed to recede as everyone in the courtroom was struck by the significance of this moment, a traumatized child finding her voice to defend the creature that had helped her heal. The judge cleared her throat. "Thank you, Lily. This is very helpful information." As Lily returned to her seat, Ethan caught her hand and squeezed it, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. She'd broken her silence not for herself, but for Scout. The courtroom dynamics shifted after Lily's intervention, but the legal realities remained unchanged. After 5 days of testimony, the judge delivered her ruling with evident reluctance. While this court is moved by the exceptional bond between the Miller family and the bobcat known as Scout, the law is clear. Wild native species cannot be kept as pets without proper authorization. The appropriate course of action is for Scout to be surrendered to wildlife authorities for assessment and eventual reintroduction to a suitable natural habitat. The words hit Ethan like physical blows. Beside him, Lily's face drained of color. "However," the judge continued, "given the unusual circumstances, I am ordering a 30-day transition period during which time the Millers may reapply for a special wildlife rehabilitation permit. If granted, this would allow supervised visitation as Scout adjusts to his new environment." It was a small concession, but far from the outcome they had hoped for. As they left the courthouse, reporters shouted questions that Ethan ignored, focusing instead on getting Lily safely to their truck through the crowd of spectators and protesters. "It's not over," Grace insisted once they were driving home. "We'll appeal. We'll reapply for the permit. There are options." But Ethan could feel the weight of defeat settling over them. The road ahead looked increasingly narrow and dark. Back at the ranch, Lily ran immediately to where Scout and the 3 German shepherds waited by the barn. The bobcat chirped happily at her approach, rubbing against her legs in a gesture that blended feline affection with canine greeting. Shadow, sensing the family's distress, moved closer to Ethan, pressing against his leg in silent support. That night, as Ethan checked on Lily before bed, he found her asleep with Scout curled against her side, tear tracks still visible on her cheeks. On her desk lay a new drawing Scout with angel wings flying above the ranch. The image sent a chill through him. It reminded him too much of how Lily had processed her mother's death, through pictures of Sarah as an angel watching over them. 30 days passed in a strange limbo. Every moment with Scout now carried the weight of impending separation. Lily took the bobcat everywhere, documenting their activities with a desperate thoroughness, as if creating evidence that might somehow change the inevitable. Scout, oblivious to the legal battles surrounding him, continued developing his unique blend of behaviors, stalking grasshoppers with feline precision one moment, obediently retrieving thrown sticks the next. Jessica Morgan visited regularly, officially to monitor Scout's condition, unofficially to help the Millers navigate the bureaucratic maze of permit applications. During these visits, Ethan found himself increasingly drawn to her compassion and quiet strength. On her 4th visit, as they walked the perimeter of the ranch checking for signs of the illegal trapping operation she was investigating, he finally asked the question that had been bothering him. "Why are you helping us? You could get in trouble." Jessica was silent for several steps before answering. "My grandfather was Shoshone. He taught me that the natural world doesn't fit neatly into the categories we try to force it into. What's happening with Scout and Lily? It's something that deserves protection, not destruction. Blackwood's behind the denial of our permit application, isn't he?" Jessica's expression tightened. "I can't prove it. But yes, I believe so. He has considerable influence with the state wildlife director. They've been hunting buddies for 20 years. This isn't about wildlife protection for him," Ethan said. "It's personal." "I know, but we need evidence." Evidence came from an unexpected source. 2 days before Scout was scheduled to be surrendered, Grace burst into the house holding a small plastic vial. "I've been running additional tests on Scout's blood samples," she explained breathlessly. "There's something unusual in his genetic profile markers that suggest he might be part of a rare genetic variation within the bobcat population. If confirmed, this could classify him as a specimen of special scientific interest." "Would that change anything legally?" Ethan asked. "It could. There are research exemptions that might apply, especially if we can demonstrate that Scout's unusual behavioral development is linked to his genetic profile." It was a thin hope, but they seized it. Grace sent the samples to a genetics laboratory at the university, while Ethan contacted their lawyer about filing for an emergency stay based on new scientific evidence. The night before the scheduled surrender, Ethan found Lily sitting on the porch swing, Scout dozing in her lap while the 3 German shepherds maintained their usual protective formation around them. The evening air held the first hint of autumn, a reminder that nearly a year had passed since they'd found the dying kitten in the snow. "Dad," Lily said quietly as he sat beside her, still a miracle to hear her speak directly to him. "If they take Scout away, will they let me visit him?" Ethan wished he could lie, offer false comfort, but Lily deserved honesty. "I don't know, sweetheart. We're still fighting to keep him here. What if—" She hesitated, stroking Scout's spotted fur. "What if we just ran away, you and me and Grace and Scout and the dogs, somewhere they couldn't find us?" The childish simplicity of her solution broke his heart. "That would make us criminals, Lily, and they would find us eventually. But it's not fair." For the first time since she'd begun speaking again, her voice rose with emotion. Scout belongs with us, with Shadow and Duke and Riley. They're his family." "I know." Ethan pulled her close, careful not to disturb the sleeping Bobcat. "Sometimes life isn't fair, even when we do everything right. Like with Mom." Lily's question was barely audible. "Like with Mom," he agreed, throat tight. They sat in silence as darkness settled over the ranch, each lost in thoughts of tomorrow's dreaded surrender. Neither noticed the faint headlights on the distant road. Turning onto the long driveway to the Miller property, Jessica Morgan's Jeep, arriving hours ahead of schedule with news that would change everything. Jessica Morgan's unexpected arrival set the dogs barking. Scout, immediately alert with his ears pricked forward in a posture that somehow combined feline wariness with canine protectiveness. Ethan moved to the porch steps as the ranger's Jeep pulled up, his body tense with apprehension. "I'm sorry to come so late," Jessica said as she climbed out, her expression unreadable in the porch light's amber glow. "But you need to know this immediately." The department director moved up the timeline. "They're coming for Scout tomorrow at dawn, not afternoon as originally planned." Lily's sharp intake of breath behind him was like a knife to Ethan's heart. "Why the change?" he demanded. "Officially, logistics, unofficially?" Jessica glanced toward Lily, then back to Ethan with a significant look. "Blackwood's been putting pressure on the director. I think he's worried about your emergency stay request and wants Scout removed before a judge can review it." Grace emerged from the house, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Can they do that? Change the time without proper notification?" "They're claiming they sent an email this morning." Jessica's tone made it clear what she thought of that excuse. "I came as soon as I found out." Ethan felt a small warm hand slip into his Lily, standing beside him now with Scout pressed against her leg. The Bobcat's golden eyes reflected the porch light, giving him an almost supernatural appearance as he stared intently at Jessica. "What about Grace's findings?" Ethan asked. "The genetic markers?" Jessica shook her head. "The director dismissed it as irrelevant without waiting for the lab confirmation. Said it was a desperate last-minute tactic." She hesitated, lowering her voice. "Listen, I'm not supposed to tell you this, but Scout isn't going to a wildlife rehabilitation center. At least not initially. They're taking him to a research facility in Idaho for behavioral assessment." "Idaho?" Grace echoed, alarmed. "That's 2 states away." "Exactly. Far enough that it would complicate any legal challenges you might bring in Wyoming courts." The calculated cruelty of the plan struck Ethan like a physical blow. Not only would Scout be taken from his family, but he'd be transported hundreds of miles away, beyond their reach both physically and legally. The clinical term behavioral assessment conjured images of sterile cages and invasive testing. "There has to be something we can do," Ethan said, his mind racing through increasingly desperate options. Jessica looked away, her professional ethics clearly at war with her personal convictions. "Officially, I can't advise you on how to circumvent a legal order." She met his eyes again. "Unofficially, if Scout were temporarily unavailable when they arrived tomorrow, it would create a procedural complication. They'd have to obtain a modified order, which would take time, possibly enough time for your emergency stay request to be heard." The implication was clear. "You're suggesting we hide him?" Grace asked incredulously. "I'm not suggesting anything," Jessica replied carefully. "I'm simply pointing out a potential scenario and its procedural consequences. Whatever you decide, I need to go now so I can truthfully say I had no knowledge of your actions after informing you of the schedule change." As Jessica drove away, the 3 adults exchanged weighted looks over Lily's head. What Jessica was tacitly suggesting wasn't just risky, it could result in criminal charges for interference with wildlife officials. But the alternative was surrendering Scout to a fate that seemed increasingly designed to prevent any chance of his return. "We could take him to the old Carson cabin," Grace suggested quietly. It's remote enough that they wouldn't think to look there. Ethan shook his head. That's the first place they'd check. It needs to be somewhere completely unexpected. Somewhere with no connection to us. I know where. Lily's small voice broke in. The cave in Thunder Canyon. We found it last summer. Scout and me and the dogs. Nobody else knows about it. Ethan and Grace stared at her in surprise. Thunder Canyon is 10 miles from here, Ethan said. When did you go that far? When you thought I was riding in the north pasture. Lily admitted. Shadow always led us home before dinner so you wouldn't worry. The cave is high up, hidden behind a fallen tree. Scout likes it there. The revelation that his 12-year-old daughter had been secretly exploring so far from the ranch was a conversation for another time. Right now, Lily's discovery might be their only option. Could you find it again in the dark? Ethan asked. Lily nodded with absolute certainty. Shadow knows the way. They moved with quiet efficiency, preparing as if for a wilderness camping trip. Grace packed medical supplies for Scout and emergency rations, while Ethan gathered sleeping bags, rain gear, and his satellite phone. Lily collected Scout's favorite toys and the dog training whistle that the Bobcat had learned to respond to with the same obedience as the shepherds. I'll stay here with Duke and Riley, Grace decided as they loaded the gear into backpacks. If I'm genuinely surprised when they arrive tomorrow looking for Scout, it will be more convincing. Shadow goes with you, he and Scout have the strongest bond, and you'll need his protection. No one voiced the unspoken fear that they were potentially breaking federal wildlife laws and risking serious legal consequences. Some lines, once crossed, couldn't be uncrossed. But watching Lily gently securing a makeshift harness on Scout, something they'd developed to take him safely on walks, Ethan knew this was one of those moments where the right choice and the legal choice had diverged beyond reconciliation. They set out shortly after midnight under a waning moon that provided just enough light to navigate by. Shadow led the way with the confidence of a guide who knew the territory intimately, Scout trotting beside him on his harness. Ethan followed with Lily, both carrying backpacks sized for overnight wilderness stays. The journey took them across the ranch's northern boundary, through a stretch of national forest land, and into the rugged terrain of Thunder Canyon. The spring snowmelt had swollen the canyon's streams, forcing them to wade carefully across at the shallowest points. Throughout it all, Scout showed none of the aversion to water typical of felines, plunging in beside Shadow with only minor hesitation. He really does think he's a dog, Ethan murmured, watching Scout shake water from his fur in a distinctly canine manner. Lily smiled in the moonlight. No, he knows he's not a dog. He just chooses to be like them, because they're his family. Her insight struck Ethan as profound beyond her years. The recognition that Scout's behavior wasn't mere imitation or confusion, but a conscious adaptation to the social structure that had nurtured him. The cave, when they finally reached it after nearly 4 hours of hiking, was indeed perfectly concealed. Set high on a rocky ledge behind a massive fallen pine, its entrance was barely visible even from a few yards away. Inside, the space opened into a surprisingly comfortable chamber, large enough to stand in, with a sandy floor and good ventilation. "See, Scout likes it here," Lily said as the Bobcat circled the space with familiar ease, eventually settling on a natural rock shelf that offered a view of the entrance. Ethan examined their sanctuary with the tactical assessment of his military training. Defensible, with good visibility of approaching threats, multiple exit options if needed, natural camouflage. It was, strategically speaking, an excellent hiding place. They set up a small camp, using battery-powered lanterns rather than fire to avoid telltale smoke. Shadow positioned himself near the entrance, his posture making it clear he was on guard duty. Ethan checked the satellite phone, relieved to find a signal, then sent a coded text to Grace. Fishing spot secured, all quiet. By dawn, they were settled in for the wait. Ethan calculated they would need to stay hidden at least until the emergency hearing, which their lawyer had promised to schedule for the following day. One night in the wilderness was a small price for the chance to keep Scout with the family. Back at the ranch, Grace faced the wildlife officials with genuine surprise and mounting indignation. "What do you mean, today?" The order clearly stated afternoon surrender. Ethan took Lily camping to give her one last day with Scout before the handover. They're expected back by noon. The lead officer, a broad-shouldered man with a perpetual frown, was skeptical. "Convenient timing. Dr. Miller, where exactly did they go camping?" "Various spots around the property," Grace answered vaguely. "It's a large ranch." Lily wanted to revisit all her favorite places with Scout. Duke and Riley, sensing the tension, positioned themselves protectively on either side of Grace. The wildlife officers eyed the German shepherds warily. "We'll wait," the lead officer decided. "But if they're not back by noon, as you claim, we'll consider it a violation of the surrender order and pursue appropriate legal action." As the hours passed at the ranch, the situation grew increasingly tense. The wildlife officers set up a surveillance point at the end of the driveway, calling in additional personnel to expand the search perimeter. By mid-morning, Thomas Blackwood arrived unannounced, ostensibly to offer assistance, but clearly there to witness Scout's removal. "Seems your brother doesn't respect the law any more now than he did in the service," Blackwood remarked to Grace, his voice carrying deliberately to the nearby officers. "Always thought the rules didn't apply to him." Grace fixed him with an icy stare. "Funny coming from a man who sets illegal traps on protected land." Blackwood's smile never reached his eyes. "Careful, Doc. That sounds dangerously like slander." In the cave, Ethan received sporadic updates from Grace via coded texts that wouldn't raise suspicion if intercepted. The wildlife department had expanded their search. Blackwood was at the ranch. Their lawyer had secured an emergency hearing for 9 a.m. tomorrow before a different judge. "How much longer do we have to stay here?" Lily asked, sharing her lunch jerky with Scout, who had adjusted to their temporary hideout with remarkable calm. "Just until tomorrow morning," Ethan assured her. "Then we'll know if the judge will let Scout stay with us while we appeal." Shadow suddenly lifted his head, ears pivoting toward the cave entrance. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Scout immediately went on alert, moving to a defensive position beside the German shepherd. Ethan motioned for Lily to stay back as he crept to the entrance, peering cautiously through the narrow opening. A flash of movement on the canyon floor below caught his eye, sunlight reflecting off something metallic. Binoculars, perhaps, or a rifle scope. His satellite phone vibrated with an incoming text from Grace. "Search expanded to forest. Dogs tracking." Someone was tracking them, and they were getting close. The wildlife department must have brought in dogs to follow Scout's scent. Ethan hadn't anticipated this development in his focus on human searchers. He'd overlooked the possibility of canine trackers. "Dad," Lily whispered, sensing his alarm, "we need to move deeper into the cave," he decided, gathering their gear. There might be searchers nearby. The cave extended further back than they had initially explored, narrowing into a passage that eventually opened into a second chamber with a small underground spring. It was cooler here, the air damp but fresh, suggesting another exit somewhere. They settled in this new hiding place. Shadow and Scout, both on high alert, the hours crept by in tense silence. Outside, the sound of voices occasionally drifted to them, search parties combing the canyon. Once, they heard the baying of tracking dogs, but the sound remained distant, suggesting the dogs had lost the scent. As night fell again, Ethan knew they'd reached a critical juncture. The emergency hearing was just 12 hours away, but maintaining their hiding place was becoming increasingly risky. The search parties would eventually find them, and facing officials after actively evading them would dramatically worsen their legal position. He was weighing their options when Shadow suddenly growled again. Hackles raised. This time, Scout echoed the warning with a strange vocalization that was neither fully bobcat nor dog. Footsteps approached the outer cave entrance, not the heavy tread of search parties, but a lighter, more cautious step. "Ethan Lilly," a familiar voice called softly. "It's Jessica." Relief flooded through him as he moved carefully back toward the entrance, signaling for Lilly and the animals to stay hidden. Jessica stood alone in the outer chamber. A flashlight pointed at the ground to minimize its visibility from outside. "How did you find us?" Ethan asked, emerging from the passage. "I followed Shadow's tracks where the search dogs couldn't. They've been looking in the wrong canyon all day." Her expression was grave. "But they're expanding the search grid. By morning, they'll find this place. We just need to make it to the hearing." Jessica shook her head. "There's been a change. The director is filing for an emergency jurisdiction transfer to federal court to bypass tomorrow's hearing. If approved, the state judge's ruling won't matter." "Can they do that?" "With enough political pressure? Yes." Jessica glanced toward the cave entrance. "But there's something else you should know. I found evidence connecting Blackwood to the illegal trapping operation, including what appears to be Scout's mother's pelt in his private collection. I've sent the documentation to the Regional Federal Wildlife Commissioner, bypassing our corrupted state office." The revelation sent a cold surge of anger through Ethan. Blackwood had killed Scout's mother, and now was orchestrating the removal of her orphaned cub not out of concern for wildlife regulations, but to cover his own illegal activities. "How long until the commissioner acts on your evidence?" "Unknown. Could be days. Could be weeks." Jessica hesitated. "But there's another option. I have a contact at the Northern Plains Wildlife Sanctuary in South Dakota. It's a legitimate, federally approved facility that specializes in rehabilitation of predator species. If Scout were surrendered there instead of to our department's custody, he'd be protected from Blackwood's influence while the legal issues are resolved. And Lilly could visit him." Jessica nodded. "It's nearly 4 hours by car, but yes, supervised visits would be permitted." It wasn't a perfect solution, but it offered a middle path between continued dangerous evasion and surrendering Scout to those who would send him far away, possibly forever. "We'd need to move tonight," Jessica said, "before they find this place." As Ethan called Lilly and the animals from the inner chamber to explain their new plan, he felt the weight of impossible choices bearing down on him. Whatever path they chose now would irrevocably shape Scout's future and Lily's. The journey back to the ranch was more harrowing than their escape had been. Every shadow seemed to hold a wildlife officer, every distant sound the approach of search parties. Shadow led them through ravines and dry creek beds where their scent would be harder to track. Scout padding silently alongside him with an alertness that reminded Ethan that despite his dog-like behaviors, the bobcat's wild instincts remained intact. Jessica had gone ahead to prepare transportation to the wildlife sanctuary while Ethan, Lilly, Shadow, and Scout made their way home to collect essential supplies and say goodbye to Duke and Riley. The pre-dawn light was just beginning to soften the eastern horizon when they crested the final hill overlooking the ranch. Ethan halted abruptly, pulling Lilly back into the cover of a juniper stand. Below, 2 wildlife department vehicles were parked by the barn, floodlights illuminating the yard where officers appeared to be conducting a systematic search of the outbuildings. "They're still there," Lilly whispered, her face pale with exhaustion and worry. "We can't go back." Ethan realized the plan to collect supplies and properly prepare Scout for transfer to the sanctuary was now impossible. If they approached the ranch, they'd be spotted immediately. His satellite phone vibrated a text from Grace. "Still being watched. Blackwood here too. Meet Jay at backup location. The backup location was an abandoned fire watchtower 5 miles east, where Jessica would be waiting with her vehicle. It meant another long hike through rough country, but they had no alternative. "Change of plans," Ethan told Lily gently. "We need to go straight to meet Jessica. Grace will have to stay behind." Lily nodded bravely, but her eyes filled with tears. "Will we get to say goodbye to Duke and Riley?" The question pierced Ethan's heart. In the chaos of evading authorities, the reality of what they were about to do hadn't fully registered with Lily. Scout wasn't just being relocated temporarily. They were surrendering him to a wildlife sanctuary. Even with visiting privileges, nothing would be the same again. "I don't think so, sweetheart. Not right now." He knelt to her level. "But we'll see them soon. I promise." They circled wide around the ranch, adding precious miles to their journey but avoiding detection. Scout was beginning to tire, unused to such extended exertion. Shadow remained vigilant, occasionally stopping to listen with ears pricked forward, ensuring their path remained clear of pursuers. The sun had fully risen by the time they reached the old fire tower, its weathered structure standing like a sentinel on a rocky promontory. Jessica's Jeep was parked at the base, hidden from the main road by a stand of ponderosa pines. She emerged at their approach, relief evident on her face. "Thank God," she breathed. "I was about to start searching for you. We need to move quickly. They've established roadblocks on all major highways out of the county." Inside the Jeep, Jessica had prepared a large transport kennel padded with blankets. At the sight of it, Scout pressed against Lily's leg, golden eyes fixed on the cage with evident wariness. "He has to go in there?" Lily asked, voice breaking. Jessica nodded sympathetically. "It's the safest way to transport him, especially through checkpoints. We'll cover it with blankets so he can rest in darkness. It's less stressful for wild animals." The word "wild" hung in the air between them, a reminder of the fundamental truth at the heart of their struggle. Despite Scout's unique upbringing and behaviors, he remained legally and biologically a wild animal. Getting Scout into the kennel proved unexpectedly difficult. The bobcat, who had obediently followed commands for months, now balked at the confined space, backing away with his ears flattened. It was Shadow who finally solved the problem. Approaching the kennel and calmly lying down halfway inside it. After a moment's hesitation, Scout followed, allowing Ethan to quickly secure the door once Shadow had backed out. "Good boy," Ethan murmured, not sure if he was addressing the dog or the bobcat. As Jessica covered the kennel with blankets, Lily knelt beside it, fingers pressed against the mesh. "I'll come see you soon," she promised Scout, tears streaming freely now. "Be brave." The most difficult moment came when they had to leave Shadow behind. Jessica's Jeep couldn't safely transport a German Shepherd along with the bobcat and 2 humans. Shadow would have to make his way back to the ranch on his own, something Ethan knew the intelligent dog was capable of, but which added another layer of heartbreak to the separation. "Go home, Shadow," Ethan commanded firmly, pointing toward the ranch. "Go to Grace." The dog whined, clearly reluctant to leave his charge, his dark eyes moving between Ethan and the covered kennel. "Go home," Ethan repeated. "Protect Grace and the others." After a moment of apparent inner conflict, Shadow turned and loped toward the ranch, stopping once on a rise to look back before disappearing over the crest. The drive to the Northern Plains Wildlife Sanctuary took them through back roads and Forest Service tracks to avoid the main highways. Scout remained quiet in his kennel, the occasional rustle of movement the only indication of his presence. Lily sat beside him, one hand resting on the blanket-covered cage, her expression a mask of exhaustion and sorrow. "The sanctuary director is expecting us," Jessica explained as they drove. "Her name is Dr. Eleanor Hayes. She's one of the country's foremost experts on rehabilitating predator species, and she's agreed to take Scout as a special case." Will she understand how different he is? Ethan asked. That he's not a typical bobcat. I've briefed her on his unique background and behaviors. She's intrigued. Actually says Scout could provide valuable insights into behavioral plasticity in wild felines. The clinical terminology made Ethan uneasy. He's not a research subject. No, Jessica agreed. But his unusual development does have scientific significance. Dr. Hayes understands he's also a beloved family member. She'll respect that. They crossed the state line into South Dakota without incident, the landscape gradually flattening into rolling prairie dotted with stands of cottonwood and aspen. By mid-afternoon, they reached the sanctuary, a sprawling facility set on 500 acres of protected land, ringed by unobtrusive security fencing and marked by a simple wooden sign. Dr. Hayes met them at the entrance, a tall woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a practical braid and the weathered complexion of someone who spent most of her time outdoors. Her expression was compassionate but professionally reserved as she greeted them. "Let's get your Scout settled first," she suggested after brief introductions. "Then we can discuss the details of his care and your visitation schedule." They followed her to a specialized enclosure far larger than Ethan had expected, nearly half an acre of natural terrain including trees, rocks, a small stream, and both sunny and shaded areas. Adjacent to it was a climate-controlled indoor space with monitoring equipment and comfortable bedding. "This is our rehabilitation habitat for native feline species," Dr. Hayes explained. "Scout will have privacy here while still allowing us to monitor his health and behavior. Once he's adjusted, we can begin assessing his unique behavioral patterns." The moment came to transfer Scout from the travel kennel to his new home. As the door opened, the bobcat emerged cautiously, immediately scanning his surroundings with alert golden eyes. His posture changed as he took in the unfamiliar environment, his body lowering, movements becoming more distinctly feline and less dog-like than they had been at the ranch. Lily watched this transformation with growing distress. "He doesn't look like Scout anymore," she whispered to Ethan. "He's scared," Ethan explained gently. "He'll adjust." But as Scout moved further into the enclosure, investigating his new territory with wary precision, the bitter truth became impossible to deny. Removed from his dog family and familiar surroundings, Scout was already reverting to more typical bobcat behaviors. The unique creature who had thrived at the ranch, who came when called, who tried to herd chickens, who slept curled against German shepherds, was already fading before their eyes. Dr. Hayes observed with professional interest. "Fascinating. His instinctive behaviors are intact despite his unusual upbringing. That's actually a good sign for his eventual rehabilitation." Ethan felt Lily's small hand slip into his, squeezing with desperate strength. He understood her unspoken fear if Scout fully reverted to wild behaviors. Would he even remember them when they came to visit? Would the bond that had helped heal Lily's wounded spirit survive this separation? Jessica seemed to read their thoughts. "This is temporary," she reminded them quietly. "Once we resolve the legal issues and expose Blackwood's operation, we can revisit the custody arrangement." But looking at Scout as he disappeared into a hollow log in his new enclosure, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that some changes, once set in motion, couldn't be reversed. The clock was ticking, not just on their legal options, but on Scout's unique connection to the human and canine family that had raised him. The drive back to Wyoming was undertaken in heavy silence. The empty space in the vehicle where Scout's kennel had been a physical reminder of their loss. Lily stared out the window with red-rimmed eyes, the wildflower-dotted prairies blurring past unnoticed. Ethan's mind raced between worry for Scout, concern for Lily's emotional state, and mounting anger toward Blackwood, whose corruption had torn their family apart. "What happens now?" he finally asked Jessica as they crossed back into Wyoming. "I've sent all the evidence to Federal Agent Carter Hammond," she replied. keeping her voice low so as not to disturb Lily, who had finally drifted into exhausted sleep. He specializes in wildlife trafficking investigations and has been tracking suspicious patterns that match Blackwood's operation. My documentation gives him enough to open a formal investigation. How long will that take? Jessica's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Honestly, it could be weeks, even months. These cases are complex. Building a bulletproof prosecution takes time. Time they didn't have. Ethan had seen how quickly Scout's behavior had begun changing in just the first hour at the sanctuary. By the time a federal investigation concluded, the unique bond between Scout and his family could be irreparably severed. The ranch was quiet when they finally arrived home. The wildlife department vehicles gone, but their intrusive presence still lingering like a bad smell. Grace met them at the door, dark circles under her eyes testifying to sleepless nights. Behind her, all 3 German shepherds crowded forward, Shadow pushing to the front to greet them first. "You made it back," Grace said, embracing Ethan and then Lily. "I was so worried." "Where's Scout?" Duke circled them, nose working the air for the familiar scent of the bobcat. Riley whined questioningly, checking behind them as if Scout might suddenly appear. Shadow, who had made the journey home alone and undoubtedly communicated in some canine way with his packmates, sat with dignified sorrow, his dark eyes fixed on Lily. "He's safe," Ethan assured Grace, though the word felt hollow. Safe, yes, but separated from everything and everyone he loved. "The sanctuary is a good place. They'll care for him properly." Lily walked straight to Shadow, kneeling to wrap her arms around the big dog's neck. "You tried to tell them, didn't you?" she whispered. "You tried to tell Duke and Riley that Scout had to stay behind." Inside, Grace had prepared a late dinner, though none of them had much appetite. As they picked at their food, she updated them on what had happened at the ranch during their absence. "The wildlife officers searched everywhere," she reported. "They were convinced you were hiding on the property. Then Blackwood showed up with that smug look of his, making insinuations about federal charges for evading the surrender order." "Did they say anything about the sanctuary arrangement?" Jessica asked. Grace nodded. "They were furious when they got the call. The lead officer, Peterson, I think his name was, said something about jurisdiction complications and stormed off. Blackwood looked like he'd swallowed a wasp." "Good," Jessica said with grim satisfaction. "The sanctuary falls under federal oversight, not state. It creates exactly the kind of administrative tangle that could buy us time while the trafficking investigation proceeds." After dinner, Ethan found Lily in her room, methodically arranging her wildlife journals on her desk. Scout's documented journey from dying kitten to unique hybrid behaving adolescent laid out in chronological order. "What are you doing, sweetheart?" he asked gently. "Making copies for Dr. Hayes," she replied without looking up. "So she understands Scout better? So she knows he's special?" The simple determination in her voice brought a lump to his throat. He sat beside her on the bed, watching as she carefully marked pages showing Scout's developmental milestones: first attempt at barking, first successful recall from a distance, first time herding the chickens alongside Riley. "That's a good idea," he said. "Dr. Hayes seemed very interested in learning about how Scout is different from other bobcats." Lily finally looked up at him, her young face solemn. "Dad, what if Scout forgets us? What if he forgets he's part of our family?" It was the question Ethan had been dreading, the fear he himself couldn't shake. "I don't think he'll forget," he said, trying to inject certainty into his voice. "The bonds he formed here were too strong. But you saw how he changed when we left him." Lily's perception, as always, was uncomfortably acute. "He started moving different, looking different. That was just stress from the new environment. It's natural for animals to fall back on instinctive behaviors when they're scared or uncertain. Lily didn't appear convinced, but she returned to her task of organizing the journals. "We need to visit him soon," she said with quiet determination, "before he forgets." The next morning brought an unexpected visitor, Shadow, who had been keeping vigilant watch from the porch since dawn. Suddenly stood at attention, ears forward. Moments later, a government SUV different from the wildlife department vehicles pulled into the driveway. A tall man in his 50s emerged broad-shouldered with close-cropped gray hair and the measured movements of someone accustomed to dangerous situations. He wore a jacket with federal insignia that Ethan didn't immediately recognize. "Mr. Miller," the man approached, offering his hand. "I'm Agent Hammond, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Special Investigations Unit. I understand you've had some trouble with local authorities regarding a bobcat." Jessica, who had stayed overnight before planning to return to a ranger station, joined them on the porch. "Agent Hammond, thank you for coming so quickly," she greeted him with evident relief. "Your documentation was compelling, Ranger Morgan." Hammond's expression remained professionally neutral, but there was a hint of something harder in his eyes. "Wildlife trafficking is my division's primary focus, and we've had the Rivercrest area on our radar for some time. Multiple shipments of illegal pelts have been traced to this region over the past 3 years. "Blackwood," Ethan said flatly. Hammond neither confirmed nor denied, maintaining federal procedural discretion. "I'd like to hear your account of events, Mr. Miller, particularly regarding the trap that killed the mother bobcat and your interactions with local officials concerning the orphaned cub." For the next 2 hours, Ethan and Jessica detailed everything finding Scout, his unusual development, the court battle, Blackwood's interference, and the eventual transfer to the sanctuary. Grace provided Scout's medical records and blood work, including the anomalous genetic markers she'd identified. Lily silently presented her journals, which Hammond examined with surprising care and attention. "These are remarkably detailed observations," he commented, handling the journals respectfully. "You have a scientist's eye, young lady." After reviewing all their documentation, Hammond delivered unexpected news. "I've obtained a search warrant for Thomas Blackwood's property, specifically his trophy room and outbuildings. It will be executed tomorrow morning." "Will that help us get Scout back?" Lily asked directly, speaking to Hammond for the first time. The agent considered her question with appropriate seriousness. "If we find evidence connecting Blackwood to illegal poaching and wildlife trafficking, and particularly if we can prove he targeted protected species including bobcats, it would significantly strengthen your case for the return of the orphaned cub to your care." "Yes. His name is Scout," Lily corrected quietly. Hammond nodded in acknowledgement. "Scout, then—" The next revelation came from an entirely unexpected direction. As Hammond was preparing to leave, Shadow suddenly left his watchful position and disappeared into the barn, returning moments later with something in his mouth. The German shepherd approached Hammond directly and dropped his find at the agent's feet, a weather-beaten trail camera, its casing cracked but the memory card compartment intact. "What's this?" Hammond asked, picking up the device. Ethan stared in confusion. "It's one of my old trail cameras. I used to have them set up around the property borders to track wildlife movements, but most of them stopped working years ago. I didn't know Shadow knew where they were." Jessica knelt to examine it. "The casing is damaged, but the internal components might still be functional." The memory card could have survived. Shadow sat beside the camera, his intense gaze shifting between it and Ethan with evident purpose. "I think he's trying to tell us something," Grace suggested. "Shadow has always been eerily intelligent, even for a German shepherd." Hammond carefully extracted the memory card. "I can have our technical division examine this. If there's recoverable data, they'll find it." After Hammond departed with the memory card and copies of all their documentation, the waiting began an agonizing period during which they could do nothing but hope the federal investigation would move quickly enough to help Scout before his unique nature was lost to reversion. 2 days later, Ethan received a call from Jessica. Her voice was taut with barely contained excitement. "Hammond executed the search warrant on Blackwood's property this morning," she reported. "Ethan, they found a hidden room in his trophy building, over 30 illegal pelts from protected species, including 3 bobcats. One matched the DNA from the blood samples Grace collected from the trap site." "Scout's mother," Ethan breathed. "Yes, but there's more." The technical team recovered footage from Shadow's trail camera. "It caught Blackwood and 2 associates setting illegal traps on your property line last November just before the storm when you found Scout." The revelation struck Ethan like a physical blow. The camera was working all this time. Apparently so. Shadow must have found it knocked down after the storm and somehow understood its importance. He's been trying to tell you about it since Scout was taken. Ethan looked across the yard where Shadow sat beside Lily on the porch swing, his dignified head resting on her lap as she absently stroked his fur. The dog who had served alongside him in war zones, who had helped raise his daughter through trauma, who had mentored a bobcat kitten into believing it could be part of their unconventional family, Shadow had been trying to protect them all along. "Hammond is bringing Blackwood in for questioning today," Jessica continued. "With the evidence from the pelts and the camera footage, they have enough for federal charges." "Ethan," her voice softened, "this could change everything for Scout." For the first time since surrendering Scout to the sanctuary, Ethan felt the tight knot of dread in his chest begin to loosen. There was hope, real, tangible hope that their family might be reunited. The third plot twist revealed itself later that evening when Hammond himself arrived at the ranch, his federal SUV kicking up dust as it sped up the driveway with unusual urgency. "We found something in Blackwood's financial records that you need to know about," he announced without preamble. 5 years ago, he made a substantial payment to a man named Frank Mercer. Does that name mean anything to you? Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. Mercer was the driver who hit Sarah's car. The police said he fell asleep at the wheel. Hammond's expression confirmed what Ethan's mind was already assembling into a horrifying picture. "We believe Blackwood paid Mercer to run your wife off the road. It wasn't an accident, Mr. Miller. It was retaliation for her environmental activism against his logging operation." The world seemed to tilt beneath Ethan's feet as the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place, the true reason behind Blackwood's vendetta. The cold calculation of his cruelty in targeting not just Scout, but Lily's emotional recovery. The revelation that Sarah's death hadn't been a tragic accident but a deliberate act orchestrated by someone they knew transformed everything. The North Dakota landscape blurred past the windows as Ethan drove toward the Northern Plains Wildlife Sanctuary, the revelation about Sarah's death still reverberating through his mind like aftershocks from an earthquake. Beside him, Lily sat with uncharacteristic stillness, her small hands clutching Scout's favorite toy, a rope bone that Duke had reluctantly surrendered when they explained where they were going. In the back seat, Shadow watched the passing terrain with alert attention, the only one of the 3 German shepherds they'd brought on this journey. It had been 2 weeks since Hammond's bombshell disclosure about Blackwood's connection to Sarah's death. 2 weeks of statements, evidence reviews, and formal charges that had transformed their small Wyoming community. Blackwood now sat in federal custody, denied bail due to flight risk and the severity of the charges: illegal wildlife trafficking, conspiracy, evidence tampering, and most seriously conspiracy to commit vehicular homicide. The case had exploded across regional news outlets, each day bringing new revelations about the scope of Blackwood's criminal activities. Other families had come forward with stories of intimidation and threats. A network of illegal trapping and wildlife trafficking stretching across 3 states had been exposed. For the residents of Rivercrest County, it was as if a long shadow had suddenly lifted, revealing ugly truths but also allowing healing light to penetrate. For the Miller family, the most immediate impact had been the emergency hearing regarding Scout. With Blackwood's corruption exposed and his influence neutralized, the original court order mandating Scout's surrender had been suspended pending review. Dr. Hayes had agreed to maintain Scout's care at the sanctuary until legal custody could be properly determined. With one significant concession, the Millers would be allowed extended visitation to help prevent Scout from fully reverting to wild behaviors. "Do you think he'll remember us?" Lily asked, breaking the contemplative silence in the car. "Of course he will," Ethan assured her, though his own uncertainty gnawed at him. It had been 16 days since they'd left Scout at the sanctuary, 16 days during which the young Bobcat had been separated from the dogs who had shaped his unusual development and the humans who had become his family. Lily seemed to sense his hesitation. "Shadow will help him remember," she said with quiet confidence, reaching back to stroke the shepherd's thick fur. "They have a special connection." As they turned onto the gravel road leading to the sanctuary, Ethan reflected on how their lives had transformed in the months since finding a dying bobcat kitten in a snowstorm. Lily, once silent and withdrawn, now spoke not only to animals but increasingly to people, her voice growing stronger with each passing day. The discovery that her mother's death hadn't been a random accident but a deliberate act had initially threatened to re-traumatize her, but instead seemed to have provided a strange kind of closure, replacing the arbitrary cruelty of chance with a narrative that, however painful, made sense of their loss. Dr. Hayes greeted them at the sanctuary entrance, her expression carefully neutral but her eyes warm with compassion. "He's been eating well," she reported as she led them toward Scout's enclosure. "Very active, especially at dawn and dusk. Physically, he's thriving." "And behaviorally?" Ethan asked, noting her specific choice of words. Dr. Hayes hesitated. "That's more complicated. He's showing strong natural bobcat instincts, stalking, pouncing, territorial marking, but he also exhibits behaviors I've never observed in wild felines. He responds to certain sounds that might remind him of your ranch. Sometimes he sits in a distinctly canine posture watching the sanctuary staff. It's as if he's straddling two worlds." They reached the viewing area for Scout's enclosure, a comfortable seating space separated from the habitat by reinforced glass that allowed observation without disturbing the animals. Dr. Hayes gestured toward the dense vegetation inside the enclosure. "He's usually napping in the rock formation at this time of day. I should warn you, he may not approach immediately. Wild bobcats are naturally cautious around humans." "Scout isn't just a wild bobcat," Lily said with quiet certainty. Dr. Hayes smiled gently. "Let's find out. Shall we?" She operated a control panel that slid open a section of the glass wall, creating an opening into the enclosure. "Normally we don't allow direct interaction, but given Scout's unique history and our special arrangement, we'll make an exception. Just move slowly and let him come to you." Lily looked to Ethan for permission, then stepped carefully into the natural habitat. Shadow followed, his movements deliberate and controlled, nose working to catch Scout's scent. Ethan entered last, scanning the rock formations and dense foliage for any sign of the bobcat. For several long minutes, nothing happened. The enclosure remained still except for birdsong and the gentle rustling of leaves in the artificial breeze created by the climate control system. Lily's face began to fall, the hope in her eyes dimming with each passing second. Then Shadow raised his head sharply, ears pivoting toward a tangle of undergrowth near the artificial stream. A faint rustling sound emerged, followed by the appearance of a pair of golden eyes shining from the shadows. Scout had grown noticeably in their absence. his spotted coat more defined, his movements more fluid and powerful. He emerged partially from cover, body low in a posture balanced between caution and curiosity. "Scout," Lily whispered, taking a small step forward. "It's us." The bobcat remained motionless, eyes fixed on them with an unreadable wild intensity. In that moment, Ethan felt a crushing weight of doubt. Perhaps they had been fooling themselves all along. Perhaps Scout's dog-like behaviors had been temporary adaptations that had already faded in their absence. Perhaps the creature they had loved was gone, replaced by the wild animal he was always meant to be. Shadow broke the impasse. With calm confidence, the German shepherd approached Scout, not directly but at an angle, recreating the same greeting ritual they had performed countless times at the ranch. He stopped a few feet from the bobcat, sat down, and made a soft whining sound in his throat, an invitation, not a demand. For a heartbeat that seemed to stretch into eternity, Scout didn't move. Then, with a chirping sound that was neither fully bobcat nor dog, he moved forward and touched his nose to Shadow's muzzle. The transformation was immediate and astonishing. Scout's entire body language shifted, the wild wariness melting away as he pressed his head against Shadow's chest in a gesture of recognition and relief. The shepherd responded by gently placing a paw over Scout's shoulders in the same protective gesture he had used when Scout was a kitten. "He remembers," Lily breathed, tears streaming down her face. "He remembers Shadow." Emboldened by this reunion, Lily slowly approached, kneeling a few feet away and holding out Scout's toy. The bobcat regarded her for a long moment, head tilted in an unmistakably canine expression of consideration. Then, with the same chirping sound, he moved from Shadow's side to investigate the familiar object. Scout sniffed the rope bone thoroughly, then looked up at Lily with an intensity that seemed to contain recognition. His spotted paw reached out, touching her hand with delicate precision. "Hi, Scout," Lily said softly. "We missed you so much." What happened next would later be documented in Dr. Hayes's groundbreaking paper on behavioral plasticity in wild felines. Scout moved forward and pressed his forehead against Lily's cheek, a greeting that combined feline head bumping with the more sustained contact typical of canine affection. Then he sat beside her in the distinctive posture he had learned from Shadow, looking up at Ethan with expectant golden eyes. The family reunion continued for over an hour in Scout's enclosure, the bobcat gradually reclaiming the behaviors and interactions that had made him unique. He fetched the rope bone when Lily threw it, responded to the hand signals Ethan used with the shepherds, and even attempted his peculiar barking sound that had always been part growl and part chirp. Dr. Hayes watched from outside the enclosure, her professional objectivity temporarily forgotten as she witnessed something unprecedented in her decades of wildlife work, a wild predator who had developed a genuine cross-species family attachment that persisted even after separation. 2 months later, the Miller Ranch received its official designation as a licensed wildlife rehabilitation and education center, with a special focus on predator species. The legal battle had concluded with an unprecedented arrangement. Scout would remain legally wild, but under the rehabilitative care of the Miller family, with regular monitoring by wildlife authorities. The certification required significant modifications to the ranch, including the construction of a spacious habitat enclosure that connected to the house through a series of secure passages, allowing Scout both freedom to express his natural behaviors and continued interaction with his unusual family. On the day of Scout's return home, the 3 German shepherds waited in formation on the porch, Shadow dignified and watchful, Duke alert and protective, Riley barely containing his excitement. When Ethan's truck pulled up with the transport kennel visible in the back, all 3 dogs broke into synchronized howling that echoed across the ranch. As Scout emerged from the kennel and took his first steps back onto the property, he moved with the confident grace of a wild bobcat. But when Shadow approached, Scout immediately dropped into a playbow, a purely canine gesture that had no equivalent in feline body language. The other shepherds rushed forward, and soon all four animals were engaged in a joyful reunion that blurred the lines between wild and domestic, between what was natural and what was family. On the porch, Grace stood with Jessica Morgan, the ranger's professional involvement with the Miller family having evolved into something more personal during the months of legal battles and sanctuary visits. Lily, now speaking comfortably with adults beyond her immediate family, was eagerly explaining Scout's behaviors to a small group of university researchers who had come to document this unprecedented case of cross-species socialization. Ethan watched it all with a sense of wonder and gratitude. The tragedy of Sarah's death would always be part of their story, but it no longer defined them. From the darkest moments of loss had emerged healing, justice, and a family expanded beyond conventional boundaries. As the Wyoming sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long golden shadows across the ranch, Scout broke away from his play with the dogs and trotted to where Lily stood. With natural grace, he positioned himself at her side, sitting in perfect mimicry of Shadow's alert posture, a wild bobcat who had chosen to be something more, something unique, something that defied easy classification, a creature who had found exactly where he belonged. In the twilight years of our lives, we often reflect on what truly matters. The story of Scout, a bobcat raised by 3 German shepherds on the Miller family ranch, reminds us that family isn't defined by blood or species, but by love and belonging. Like many of us who have weathered life's storms losing loved ones too soon, facing injustice, or struggling to heal broken hearts, the Millers found hope in the most unexpected places. Scout's journey mirrors our own resilience, how we adapt to change while holding on to our essential nature. When Lily found her voice again through her connection with this wild creature, she teaches us that healing comes in forms we never anticipate. For those of us who have raised children and grandchildren, Scout's ability to bridge 2 worlds, wild and domestic, resonates with how we've watched our own families forge their paths while maintaining connections to home. In our generation that has seen so much change, this remarkable story affirms that the bonds we nurture are what sustain us through life's hardest challenges. Sometimes the family we choose, like Scout chose his shepherds, brings the deepest healing. And isn't that, after all, what we all seek in our journey through this world? A place where we truly belong,